The other room. From the very moment I stepped foot into that old house perched on the hillside, I felt something off. It wasn't that the place looked sinister, just old and too quiet. You know the kind of silence that feels thick, like a held breath? That was the house. Initially, I brushed it off. I had bigger worries than a creaky floor or dusty corners. At first, I barely noticed the narrow door hidden behind that ancient tapestry at the end of the corridor. It was small, easily overlooked, and I had no reason to care about what lay beyond it. But the house had a way of changing that. A few days passed, and everything seemed routine. Until one evening, as I unpacked yet another box of my belongings, I felt it. An urge, sudden and overwhelming, to reach for that hidden door. It was as if the door itself had whispered my name. The feeling slithered into my mind without warning. I tried the knob, but of course, it was locked. No key I owned fit. Yet the urge only tightened its grip, refusing to let go. Something behind that door wanted my attention, and I wanted it back. Then the dreams began. They started as hazy fragments, just flashes of a room I didn't recognize. I'd wake in the darkness, heart pounding, confused sweat on my skin. Each dream left me breathless, choking on questions I couldn't form. In those nightmares, I stood in an unfamiliar room. I didn't know who it belonged to, or even who I was in that moment, but I sensed its importance. I needed a key, the key that would bridge the gap between dream and reality. Night after night, the dreams deepened. I saw details I wished I could unsee: old, rotting furniture draped in dust, wallpaper peeling like dead skin, stale air thick enough to taste. Each time I woke, I swore I knew that room, like I had stood there once before. Or many times before. But how? Why couldn't I remember? Soon I didn't need to be asleep to sense it. By day, just standing near the locked door, the corridor seemed to shrink. The ceiling felt lower, the walls pressed in, and a faint smell of old paper and mold drifted under my nose. I swear some presence hovered just behind me, close enough to feel its cold breath. Every second I delayed, my pulse hammered harder. I snapped. One evening, I grabbed a crowbar and forced that stubborn door open. The wood cried out and then gave way. When I stepped inside, my stomach knotted. It was the room from my dreams, no doubt about it. A dim, cramped space lit only by a cracked windowpane that allowed in a sliver of dying daylight. Dust motes hovered like tiny ghosts. The air was heavier than in my nightmares. I could hardly breathe. Walls covered in photographs drew me closer. My skin crawled as I peered at them. Some faces I couldn't place. Others looked eerily like mine, but twisted, expressions contorted, smiles that didn't belong on human lips. And there were details in the background, shapes half hidden, things lurking just out of frame. My head spun. The room wavered, as if I might pass out at any second. Then I found the journal on a tiny desk in the corner. Its leather cover crumbled under my fingertips. Inside, the handwriting nearly matched my own, but I knew I hadn't written these words. Each page told fragmented stories about a woman who could have been me, or maybe just wore my face. The events were tangled and nonsensical. None fit my life, yet something about them rang familiar, like a dream you can't fully shake. The final entry made my blood turn to ice. The room is not yours. It never was. The memories you carry are borrowed, and they will consume you. I slammed the journal shut and staggered back. Borrowed memories? Was I even myself? Could someone else have lived here, looked like me, twisted my image into these photos? And if so, who or what had I become? The nightmares only grew worse after that. Sleep and waking blended into one endless horror. I saw that room at all hours, felt its stale breath on the back of my neck no matter where I stood. I questioned every memory I had: were they truly mine, or some hand-me-down from a stranger's past life? Driven by desperation, I ransacked the attic and found another door. Behind it, more boxes, more journals, more photographs. All featured that same haunting figure who looked so much like me. But none were truly me. Each image was like a cracked mirror, showing me a version of myself that I'd never been, or had I been her before? Despite my fear, I realized I belonged in that terrible room. I didn't want to, but I did. The thought made me tremble. The sense of recognition, the familiar rot of the wallpaper, the cruel twist of those photographed faces, it all pulled me back. It felt both wrong and inevitable. Now, I can't trust my senses. I can't tell what's real or imagined. Each time I try to forget, new fragments of memory surface, pressing against my eyes until I see them even when I'm awake. The more I struggle to be myself, the more I become her. The house, the room, they won't let me go. They want me to remember something I can't quite grasp. And as I stand here, unsure if I'm truly alive or just a phantom caught in an endless loop, I realize the truth: this has happened before. Maybe many times. I'm trapped in a cycle of rediscovery, forever drawn to that door, forever prying it open, forever finding that room that was never mine and yet completely mine. I know one thing: the room is waiting, and whatever lives behind that door has all the time in the world to reclaim me piece by piece. This is not my beautiful house. Sarah jolted awake to the scent of raw iron saturating her lungs. She blinked, disoriented. It was morning, at least, she thought so. A grainy, reddish light seeped in from where her curtains should have been, as if the world outside was drenched in arterial haze. The air tasted heavy, thick with moisture, as if she were breathing through a hot, blood-soaked rag. As her vision cleared, she noticed the walls were wrong. Last night, they'd been a calm eggshell white. Now they were something else entirely, something alive. They gleamed with a dark, crimson translucence, as though someone had peeled back human skin and stretched it across her bedroom. Veins, throbbing with sluggish fluid, spiderwebbed through this fleshy surface. Tiny nodules twitched here and there, like budding tumors, and when she pressed a trembling hand to it, the wall's warmth and yield reminded her nauseatingly of fresh meat. The surface flexed at her touch, quivering as if delighted by her presence. Panicking, Sarah snatched her hand away. The spot she'd touched dimpled inward, then secreted a droplet of clear fluid that trickled down the living wall. Her bedroom door, her real, wooden door, was gone. In its place was a fleshy aperture, puckered and rimmed with glossy cartilage. Stiff, tooth-like spines quivered around this opening like hungry anemones. "Mark," she called, her voice small and cracking. "Mark, are you here?" There, faint sounds drifting through the hallway, something clattering softly, like dishes, but was it really dishes now? Relief flickered through her. If Mark was in the kitchen, maybe he hadn't changed. Maybe he knew what was going on. She glanced at her phone. Its screen was no longer glass but a transparent membrane revealing squirming flesh beneath. She dropped it with a gasp. Steeling herself, Sarah approached the door. The fleshy gateway tightened slightly as she neared, and when she pressed through, she felt the tooth-like protrusions brush against her arms and shoulders. They flexed and caressed her skin, leaving a slick residue behind. She emerged into a corridor transformed. The walls rippled in slow waves, each ripple sending a fresh surge of humid, metallic-scented air into her lungs. The floor was matted with short, hair-like filaments that glowed faintly with each step, leaving phosphorescent footprints that faded behind her. The hallway's old family photos still hung in their places, sort of. Now, each frame was fused into the fleshy wall, half submerged in tissue. The images inside were distorted. Mark's face and hers, once captured in happy moments, now stretched and elongated. Eye sockets yawned into deep black pits. Limbs bent at impossible angles. In one photograph, Mark's head turned slowly, impossibly, following her as she passed. She choked down a scream. In the kitchen, the air smelled rancid and sweet. She found Mark at the counter, his back to her. He fiddled endlessly with plates, stacking and restacking them. Only, they weren't plates anymore. They were pale, bone-like shards arranged in mocking table settings. Each time he moved, his joints popped wetly, like cracking knuckles submerged in oil. "Mark," she said, voice wavering. "Thank God you're here. We have to get out. The apartment, something's happening." He turned to face her. His smile was all wrong, too wide, too crowded with row after row of razor-edged teeth. Blackish fluid oozed from his tear ducts, running down his cheeks in oily streaks. His skin glistened like the walls, as though the same feverish life infecting the apartment had invaded his flesh. Beneath his shirt, something wriggled, as if tiny creatures were dancing under his skin. "Good morning, sweetheart," he greeted, in a voice thick with fluid and gurgling echoes. "I've been setting the table, you see." He lifted a piece of bone china, bone, literally, and tapped it with a claw-like fingertip. "The apartment's hungry today." His lips twitched, exposing even more teeth. "And you, my dear, are the new tenant. You know what that means, don't you?" She stumbled back, mouth dry, heart pounding like a dying animal. "Mark, please." He reached out with two long arms that bent in too many places. "Don't worry," he hissed, voice bubbling with slimy undertones. "The absorption only hurts until you stop being you." Behind her, Sarah heard a wet, slurping sound as the fleshy door sealed closed. The corridor's living tissue throbbed faster, as if excited. The apartment's heartbeat quickened. She felt it under her feet, beneath her fingertips, inside her own chest. Something vast and hungry was digesting its surroundings, and her, trapped in the belly of a twisted organism that had once been her home. Mark lunged, and she screamed. Outside the windows, if there still were any, no one would hear. The apartment was no longer a place of wood and plaster, but a predator made of living flesh, bent on consuming every trace of her humanity. And as it fed, she knew she would become part of it, another memory swallowed whole, never to see the light of day again.